Exploring Nature's Tapestry is actually a series of full engagement programs with our local biodiversity experts featured in our current exhibition, Sensory Odyssey, Into the Heart of Our Living World. So in a short while, we will have one of our experts, Dr. Hari, who will be sharing his research carried out in the acoustics of melting glaciers. He just came back for a recent trip to Svalbard in the Arctic, and we can't wait to hear more about how he uses robotics to capture the sounds of the melting ice. He will also cover how his research allows countries like Singapore to come up with measures to adapt to future sea level rise. So I think without further ado, I will pass the mic to Dr. Hari Vishnu to tell us more. Dr. Hari, please.
Thanks for that generous introduction, Houdin. Whoa, almost full house. I'm honored. Okay, without further ado, I will go into the story of one of the magical worlds that you have already seen at the Sensory Odyssey exhibition, or you will see, and that's the world of the Arctic glaciers, the icy blue realm of melting Arctic glaciers. Hopefully, by the end of this, I'll have convinced you more about the beauty of this place, if you're already not, and about the song of the glaciers, and sadly, why it is a song of changing times. A little bit about the work I do. I'm a researcher in the National University of Singapore. I work on acoustics, robotics, and vision for marine sensing. Mostly on acoustics. Why sound? Well, it turns out that in underwater environments, sound travels much longer than electromagnetic waves, like light, for example. So you can't really use light much underwater, but you can use sound. So sound is a window into what's happening underwater. And so people have been using sound to explore the underwater realm for a long time. For example, I have also been using sound to study biodiversity, like pink dolphins in Singapore waters, for example. Our lab has been using sound to study the health of coral reefs. And of course, it has many other applications like defense and deep sea exploration, so on and so forth. Now, apart from sound, there might be some places where sound is not enough to sense an object from far away. You might need to get up close and personal, right? But we might not be able to do that because these areas are dangerous, inaccessible, hazardous, for whatever reason. And so in such cases, we tend to use robots, right? And examples of that might include space exploration, deep sea, or in our case, we use robots to explore the glacial fronts. And we explore three aspects of that: underwater, on water, and in air. So these are the two parts of my work which I will be talking about today. Now, before I go into what it is that I was doing in the Arctic, I need to talk about, I think, why we did it. So, two words: climate change. I think we are all aware of it by now. It's all around us. It makes the headlines every day. It's catching more and more of the news daily, and it's become a harsh and sad reality, right? Now, because it's intensifying, now is even more important time for us to understand climate change and monitor it, now more than ever. Now, how does this translate to the context of the Arctic? Well, the Arctic is the region which is the most sensitive to climate change. The Arctic is heating at 3 to 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. We talk about global warming, but it's most visible in the Arctic. It's not to say that the rest of the world isn't heating up, right? Singapore is also actually heating up faster than the global average, and that's because of something called the urban heat island effect. But the heating of the Arctic affects all of us too. So it's not like the Arctic is far away and so we are disjoint from it and we are not affected. No, that's because the whole world is connected by this large conveyor belt called the ocean. The ocean keeps transporting heat and salt around, and so what happens in the Arctic affects us here. And the faster it melts, it's going to go into this feedback mechanism where all these climate change effects are going to compound on us. The most direct consequence that we can think of is sea level rise, right? The glaciers, the ice melts, goes into the sea, and the sea level rises. And low-lying areas and coastal areas, including Singapore, are particularly vulnerable to this because we have a large low-lying coastal area. But that's not the only effect. There can also be other effects like destructive weather hazards and loss of biodiversity and so on and so forth. So all the more important for us to understand what's happening in these polar regions, because that's where most of these effects are beginning from. Now, when we talk about what the impacts are. The scientists have been studying this for quite some time, and scientific efforts in studying climate change has been building up over time. So there is this international body called IPCC, which has been trying to collate all the science and translate it into something that everybody can understand. And so they try to come up with these predictions on what does it mean for us in terms of sea level rise, in terms of global temperatures, etc. So that's one of the plots there. I'm not going to go into detail or get too technical here, but what I do want to show is there is a bit of an uncertainty there, right? If you look at that plot, the lines are going with a bit of a spread. That's telling us that in the worst case scenario, or at least in a bad case scenario, by about 2100, sea levels might rise by, the average sea level might rise by about a meter, 0.9 meters. It might vary at different parts of the world. But there is a big spread there. In the best case scenario, it might be about 0.5 meters. So there is a half a meter spread there. That's about 50%. That's a lot, right? We actually need to get better than that and understand how is it going to impact us, especially in the context of places like Singapore, where a large part might be within that band of uncertainty. I think about 30% or something like that at high tide. So for this, partly the uncertainty comes from not knowing how human activities are going to change, but partly it also comes from lack of data in these places. We don't understand the climate change system completely because it's a very complex, interdimensional, interdisciplinary field. There's too many things that need to be taken into account, and we need better data, more informed data, because with better data, we get better information on the climate impacts. That translates into more preparation and more resilience. So that's why we would like to play a part in studying these climate change impacts and ice loss in these places. So going into more specifics, we are studying how the ice is lost and how much ice is lost. Now there are two ways in which ice is lost in these icy glacial regions, right? You might have seen videos of the Arctic where you see these big pieces of ice just breaking off and going into the ocean. That's called calving, essentially. So calving is basically where the ice breaks off and falls into the ocean. There's also melting happening underneath, which we don't see in these videos, but it happens. That's because the ocean, the warm ocean, comes and comes in touch with the glacier down there and also melts it. And that's also a significant component. So there are two components of ice loss here. Now, unfortunately, it's too dangerous to get too close to the glacier there, near the glacier terminus. And the reason is why, basically the same thing I said, calving. You don't want to be anywhere near when that happens, right? It's not just about the ice falling on you. Well, if the ice falls on you, that's the end of your research campaign and more. But going beyond that, even if it falls within like a half a kilometer or about a few hundred meters away, even that could be dangerous. Because once that ice block falls, it generates a huge wave that can come and just wash you over or topple you. So that region near the glacier, that's particularly dangerous. And it's not like we can just go there and take measurements. You have to meet in a safe distance, right? And so the only option we have here to study that is remotely. So we would like to use remote sensing. And people have been doing remote sensing of glaciers in the past with satellites mainly, satellites and video coverage. But satellites have their own disadvantages. For example, they can't tell you what's happening underwater. They may not work in cloud coverage or when there is fog, for example. And they may not work in the night, whereas sound does not have any of these drawbacks. So sound is a good complement to existing methods. So what kind of sound might we pick up over there? Well, I'm going to play a video of an Arctic glacial bay. So we are probably used to thinking that the Arctic is a very serene, silent place, but maybe this video will convince you that it's a very happening place. It's serene, yes, it's beautiful, yes, but it's not dull. There's a lot happening. There's water circulation coming in, going out, ice keeps breaking out. You can see the ice keeps breaking out and then it's carried out, and then more water comes in and goes out again. And well, this is a time-lapse video, so it's, of course, it's sped up, but you can see that it's not static, right? There's a lot happening over there. So it turns out that all these ice loss processes, calving, melting, etc., they produce sound, which is good news as far as we are concerned, because now that gives us one more way to understand what is happening there, right, by listening to them. So when the ice falls into the water, you can obviously guess that it produces this crashing sound, right, like as if you throw a rock into the water. But the ice blocks are so huge that that sound can be heard for up to many kilometers, sometimes even tens of kilometers, sometimes even way beyond that. It has been described as one of the loudest signals. And not just calving, but also underwater melting, where the warm water comes in touch with the ice and melts it. That also produces an interesting sound. Now that sound is produced because the glacier ice has bubbles trapped inside it at high pressures. Think of it like a soda can, right? Now when the ice melts, those bubbles are ejected out with large velocity. And so each bubble going out produces this pop sound. So let me show you a video of a bubble being released. So what you see on the left here is glacier ice with two bubbles that are now released as soon as the ice melted, right? Well, actually more than a bubble, there are a couple of bubbles over there. Now each bubble produces a pop sound, but when many of these bubbles are coming out randomly over a very large area of the glacier terminus, what you get now is something more like this, like something is frying down there. To me, it sounds like frying French fries, frankly. And that's because the warm water over there is melting the ice over there, releasing all these particles, right? And that's the sound that we've been trying to record, monitor, and understand. Right, so there are benefits to using this sound because, like I said, sound travels a long area, so you can listen this from far away in the safety of your recording equipment. It's relatively cheap and inexpensive to deploy and record. It doesn't take much storage space like video does, and it also captures underwater information, which photography can necessarily not do. Now, before I go into our campaign, I want to mention a unique link that this sound has with Singapore waters. It just so turns out that if you put a microphone into Singapore waters and listen to the sound, you pick up a very similar frying-like sound right here in Singapore waters. The reason for that is this pesky little creature called the snapping shrimp. You can see that it has that large claw over there, and it uses that to stun its prey. So let me show you a high-speed video of that, right? It creates a bubble and explodes that, and that produces a pop sound. And when you have tens of thousands of these creatures living all around the seabed, again, you get a very similar frying sound. I'm told they are not great for eating, but they do produce a lot of noise. Now, that's a weird and uncanny link between the Arctic world right there and Singapore here, right? Although we are like geographically very different and weather-wise very different, we have this unique bond. That's also how I ended up getting into this research, because we were talking about the snapping shrimp noise at some conference, and one of our collaborators came and said, you know what, we listened to this sound in the Arctic as well. So maybe you should come and apply your techniques in the Arctic, and maybe we'll see what we can learn from that sound. That's actually how I got into this. So if you're thinking what a tropical researcher is doing in the Arctic, well, this is how I got pulled in. Now moving on to our campaign. So we have been studying the Arctic to understand this sound and monitor its ice loss. And actually we've been doing this since 2019. But I also did it earlier this year, as Houdin pointed out. I was there for 2 months between June to August. We went to 2 locations, and it was in Svalbard up in the north over there, as you can see. Specifically 2 locations, Kongsfjorden in the north and Hansen in the south. Just zooming in, you can see the place where the white meets the blue. That's where the glaciers are, right? That's where the tidewater glaciers are. That's where the ice loss is happening. So those red spots are where we went. And the region over there, Ny-Ålesund, that also turns out to be the northernmost populated human settlement in the world. These places have been losing ice at an incredible rate. Like when you go there, you can actually see climate change very obviously with your own eyes. This plot is trying to tell you that in Hansen, for example, you could see the ice retreated by about 3 kilometers from 1991 to 2015. In Kongsfjorden, it's even worse. It retreated 13 kilometers since 1860, but about 3 kilometers since 2000. And in fact, it's even accelerating. So you can actually see how fast this region is retreating. The glaciers are going back. And it's weird because when you go there and when we try to go close to the glaciers to monitor the sound, sometimes the ship's navigation system or the navigation maps don't work. And when you ask them, why is the map not working? They tell you, oh, that's because the maps were too old and the maps are not updated fast enough to catch up to climate change. So the map will tell you that you are inside the glacier. But actually the glacier is no longer there. The glacier has retreated like many kilometers away, right? And that's a weird experience, but it's also a sad reality of how fast the glaciers are melting there. So what we do, well, the science we do has two aspects. Like I said, the first part is sound. We try to record the sound using underwater microphones, which we also call hydrophones. So what we do is we put the microphones on a line and dip them underwater from a boat, like you see over there. So when you put them on a line and you put them underwater, you can make it act like an acoustic camera, right? So your photograph camera, it has many sensors together. Similarly, this acts like an acoustic camera where you have many sound sensors together and it paints an acoustic picture, telling you where is the sound energy coming from. And then we go as close to the glacier as it is safe, not necessarily very close, but as safe as it's possible. And we put the underwater microphone array down there and record the sound. You can see there I laid out that long array that's actually about 30 meters long. That's pretty long, near the Polish Polar Station in one of the areas we went to. And down there you can see me deploying it with my colleague, Dr. Bharat, who also joined me on this campaign. So when we deploy this array, we listen to the sound, we record it. And the good part here is we figured out that the more the melt, the more the sound. So that's a good thing for us, because now that means if more melting needs to more sound, then all you need to do is record the sound and you get an idea about how fast it's melting, right? Well, that's the good news. The bad news is it's not that simple. The more sound that is produced, it's fine, but the sound that is produced at the glacier terminus where the melting is happening is not the sound that you hear, right? So the glacier itself acts like this large surround sound speaker, and all parts of the glacier are melting, and you're in the middle of this listening to all this sound. But the sound that comes to you is not exactly what was transmitted. It undergoes different levels of distortion. So how to understand what was the sound that was transmitted at the glacier terminus? Well, clearly you can't go up to the glacier terminus because it's very dangerous there, as I told you. But how do we understand whether what we are listening to, how representative is that of what is transmitted near the glacier? So when we can't do it, what do we do? When we can't do some tasks and whether they're dangerous to do, what do? We outsource them to robots, right? So using robots now, the glacier is no longer inaccessible. And that's the second part of what we did. We took robots up to the Arctic, lots of them. We took that small, cute little bunny-like robot you see, the yellow robot. We call that a GLAMR, Glacial Ablation Monitoring Robot. Scientists like to come up with funky abbreviations, you see. And the idea was to send it right up to the glacier terminus. And you can see in that photo, it got close to an iceberg. That was not the terminus, actually. It was the iceberg, but I have more photos later. That's my colleague, Dr. Mandar, deploying it. We had another robot also in collaboration with NTNU, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and they brought a much larger surface robot, which we instrumented. So that was another part of our campaign. And that's a much bigger vehicle that spans about that size, the size of this whole region. And it's big enough for 1 or 2 people to actually even lie down inside if you want. Believe me, I've tried. That's not what it's meant for, but what it's meant for is go straight to the glacier like that. And you can see it did pretty well in getting very close to the glacier, into that danger zone, right, where we would never have been able to. And so we sent robots close to the glacier, monitored the sound, the temperature, the salinity, took a bunch of videos. And so I'm just going to run you through some of the photos of our whole campaign. That is an example where we put a GoPro on the robot and just measured the sound and just took a video of the whole glacier from one end to the other. On the right top there, you can see a photo taken from far away where we are in that boat and we are going as close as we can. We can't get really close. It's still far away from the glacier, at least half a kilometer away, and then we put the robot in. In that photo, you can see the GLAMR robot, the yellow bunny-like thing is getting closer and closer to the glacier, and you can see it's holding a buddy behind it. So there's basically one yellow dot and 2 white dots. And that white buddy is basically what's holding the underwater microphone, recording all this sound, right? And then we let it go all along the glacier, recording the sound. The photo on the left is particularly special to us because at that point, the robot was not even near the glacier. It was under the glacier. Like, the glacier has this cut at the bottom where it goes inside like a cave due to the melting. And our robot actually got into that cave. Like, it was technically, if you looked at the GPS, it would tell you it was inside the cave, inside the glacier. And in fact, it was so far away that we could not get a good photo with our telescopic lens on our camera. So that photo was actually taken through a binoculars, because that was the best option we had. But you can see that it's done pretty well in getting close there, and in the end, we did get it back, so that's good news. And through all these robotic deployments, we got a whole bunch of videos as well to study the place. So we got some aerial drone footage, which I'm going to try and play here. Yeah. So that's one of the glaciers, one of the red spots I showed in one of the maps over there. And you can see how beautiful that place is. And what I've seen when I've gone there, which surprised me, is that no two glaciers look the same at all. They each have different characters. It's like different people. They have different levels of activity, different geography. We took some videos from the water surface also, using that big robot that I was speaking about. So this is from the sea surface, and that video actually doesn't do justice, but this was really close to the glacier. This was like within 10 meters of the glacier, which means if there was carving, that robot might not have survived, but our collaborators were pretty adventurous and happy to take it that close. We also got some neat underwater video over there. This is not probably going to be, it's going to be a bit hard to understand what's going on, but this video is underwater and looking up at the surface. And now we are winching it down, which means we are sending it underwater, deep underwater, to see what you see at depth. And the interesting thing was, after a point, you see a lot of bubbles. Like, that's like a whole bubbly mix over there, like somebody threw a soda can in there. And the bubbles just keep increasing as you go down. And that actually is not something we expected. That was something that was not even mentioned in the literature or anywhere. So we saw a lot of these really exciting, cool new things, only because we were able to send robots right up to the glacier. And I should mention that, in fact, this is the first time in the world that this has been done, that robots have been sent right up to the glacier. And that was done this year by us. Before I wrap up, I just want to show some quick photos of the wildlife I observed over there. There's quite a bit of biodiversity there, as you can understand. So there's a lot of reindeer over there. In fact, reindeer were there even walking on the roads and in the cities. It's like, after a point, you just get used to them. The one on the top right is an Arctic fox, although from here it looks more like a monkey, but once it brings its white coat and all its glory, you will appreciate it more. The one on the bottom left here, this is actually a blue whale. You can just see its tail once it splashes and goes in. Okay, excuse my excited emotions. I tend to. That's a puffin, and well, I have a video of the puffin flying, but oops, I should have. And that's a harbor seal. There were a few more whales that we saw, but I couldn't record them all. They were just either too far or too fleeting to capture. We actually saw 2 blue whales, in fact, so they seem to have been a pair. A few more icy cool pics before I end. That's a video of us crossing the river to get to the other side, to get closer to the glacier and then put our robot in there. It was a bit of a dangerous moment for us there. That on top is the glacier ice field, seeing from an aerial view. That's an under ice cave, a bit of a rare occurrence, let's say, not easy to access one, but we had a collaborator who actually decided he wanted to go under ice and risk the ice falling on him. And that is us doing a trek on one of the mountains in the area, so that we could get an excellent view of the whole place. So let me wrap up by stating that the science we are trying to do here is to monitor the sound of the glaciers, and with the aim of understanding even better how fast it's melting. Hopefully this can improve our climate models and then tell us in the end how it's going to impact the whole world, including us here in Singapore, right? And of course, we can't do this alone. National University of Singapore is not in this alone. We have been successful in finding a lot of international collaborators who are joining hands with us on this. So we have University of California, San Diego, Norwegian University of Science and Technology, Arctic University of Tromsø, and Polish Academy of Sciences, and more are joining hands. And again, we have, we've named our group IPA OMG because we love funky abbreviations, right? And I think I should mention that it's a matter of pride, I think, for us that Singapore is able to take the lead on something here that is of global relevance. We are able to use local talent to solve such a huge issue. And we are able to bring together collaborators from all around the world to do that. So I think that's something we should all be happy about. Those are all my collaborators, including the ones from Singapore, Dr. Mandar from my lab and Dr. Bharat from my lab. All right, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and let me leave you with this drone video I took at one of the glaciers when there was a big carving event right there. Yeah, that was huge. I was lucky enough to catch that. It was not orchestrated. So hope I've convinced all of you that the Arctic is cool and beautiful if you did not already know. So hope we can all do our bit to protect it. Thank you. If any of you have questions about this, I'll be happy to take it. Just ask away, anything.
Yeah, so if anyone have questions, we take some time before we wrap up. So if you do have questions, raise your hand up and we'll pass the mic to you. You do?
Why did you pick the Arctic over Antarctica? And can I also ask, you said that the Arctic was melting the fastest. Does that also include a comparison to Antarctica?
Yeah, both great questions. I'll answer the second one first. The Arctic is melting the fastest, faster than Antarctica. There are a couple of reasons for that. But yes, the Arctic is melting much faster than Antarctica. Partly the reason is because when the Arctic melts, it loses ice, and when the ice is gone, the ice is very good at reflecting the sunlight back into the atmosphere. Whereas when that ice is gone, that reflection is gone, and then the ocean just absorbs it. So that's one of the reasons why the Arctic is heating up faster than the Antarctic. In the Antarctic, this does not happen. And that's also one of the reasons we went to the Arctic, because that's where climate change effects are hitting fastest and hardest. That's not to say we are not interested in the Antarctic, and in fact we do want to go to Antarctic and Greenland later on. Our long-term goal is to use these sound monitoring stations and go to much larger regions, not just Svalbard like Greenland, for example, put it out there. We just want a small device that we can just throw into the ocean, let it sit there for months, record, take it back and see what we picked up, right? And we want to do this in the Antarctic as well. And in fact, we are doing that. Come to think of it, I am going to the Antarctic in January to February to record it. But the reason we picked Arctic is that's where the first stage of climate change effects are coming in. You can see the effects coming in first. So Antarctic holds a much larger amount of water, and eventually we do want to study it. But this is the reason we picked Arctic.
Any other question?
I have one.
You have a question? You want to ask?
I can just say, great talk we're doing.
Thank you.
I'm just wondering, how do you isolate the sound? Which sound is important to you among all the sound quality?
Yeah, again, thank you for the question. Great one. So the two main things we are interested in is carving and melting. And luckily for us, nature designed it in a way that carving and melting have slightly different frequencies. So if we separate it out into different frequencies, we can separately listen to carving and melting. Those are the two things we are interested in because those are the two components of ice loss, like I was telling you, right? Now, how do you isolate what part of the glacier it's coming from? Actually, there's no way to do that. What you listen to is addition of the sound coming from all around the glacier. In some ways, it's good because it gives you a summary of what's happening all around you. But if I wanted to isolate what's coming from each part of the glacier, I would have to use a different kind of acoustic equipment. There are ways to do that. So we did do that as well, where we put in something that tells you which direction is this sound coming from. Anybody else have questions? Please go ahead.
You mentioned in the Arctic the ice is moving backwards tremendously. How has that, in your view, affected the communities that live there?
Quite a bit, yeah, I do. So it has affected, for one, you can see how it affects biodiversity quite a bit. So one of the things over there is the visiting migratory birds, for example. Their patterns are completely messed up, is what I hear. So there was a set period or set time of the year when there would be these birds like little auks and puffins, which would come in, lay eggs, mate, etc., etc. Well, mate and lay eggs in that order. But now apparently that order is all messed up. They don't know when to come, and apparently that has been happening faster and faster, but that apparently messes up their cycle. Similarly, polar bears also are a bit confused. So the biodiversity is pretty confused. And when the biodiversity is confused, the local communities also get pretty affected, right? So, well, one of the things there is something that was very normal there to do was hunting. It was normal to hunt whales and bears and things like that. That has been outlawed quite some time ago, which I think is a good thing. But some of the locals are still allowed to hunt some kind of species, and they are not allowed to do that anymore, partly because already these animals are in danger because of climate change, that they are asked, okay, please don't do that anymore because you have to find some other way to find a living. Other than that, how would I say local communities are affected? Well, it's more about places that were really, which people adapted to live in really cold conditions. They don't need to do that anymore. In fact, even I was shocked when I went, and somebody asked me earlier, who didn't ask me earlier, how was it? Was it very cold? Sadly, not very cold. Like surprising, but I was over prepared for the cold, I would say. So I think that's a bit of a sad observation. It was comfortable for me, but it was a bit of a sad observation. Please go ahead.
Can I check, like, with regards to... Hi, I have a couple of questions. Can I check with regards to, like, this acoustic way of measuring it? Is it the objective to kind of understand how the ice is melting in a real-time basis as compared to, like, video footage? Then, like, would you set up points near this thing and, you know, just use radio connected, you know, frequency signal to beam back, you know, data over time instead of just, you know, making all the way trip there, you know, just to measure for like a couple of minutes to obtain the data. And I was also wondering whether there could be, you know, sort of like related to acoustic measurement, like if you were to measure these, plant something on the land to measure the seismic activity, is that also feasible? And the third thing is with regards to the amount of air that's trapped inside, you know, this ice. Is it a constant, or is it dependent on that specific region? And are you measuring the rate of change by getting a base reference noise level and comparing the rate of change or the acoustic level over time? Thanks.
All great questions, thank you. The first one, so we do want to do both types of acoustic measurements. We want to do real-time also, and there are efforts underway currently to do real-time acoustic sensing, where a sound happens and you immediately detect it, it uploads it somewhere, and you can view it, right? Of course, it's not really easy because these places are inaccessible as it is, and if you lay some kind of a fiber optic or internet cable or some sort of equipment in one place, that's not where the glacier is going to be next year. The glacier is going to retreat. In winter, it's going to advance a little bit. In summer, it's going to retreat even further. So those sort of challenges exist, but we do have plans for some form of real-time monitoring. That said, it is fairly simple to do long-term monitoring with this and learn from maybe months or over a year of recordings, how does the sound level change over time? And once we build that understanding, we'll be in a much better position to guide future deployments. So we are doing that also. Some of our colleagues have put underwater moorings. So buoys are one way to do it, but buoys have a risk of the fact that when winter comes, there's a lot of ice in the bay. And even if not ice in the bay, there are icebergs that might come and just hit the equipment. So I know some of our colleagues who tried buoys, but we have colleagues who have put moorings, which are basically sensors sitting at the bottom. They just stay there until we come next year, send a signal, and then they come up. And so we have like many months of recordings. So that's something we are trying to do, and we are working towards real-time sensing, although we haven't gotten there yet. People do put sensors on the glacier as well for seismic sensing, as you said. That's also, I would say, an upcoming field, fairly successful. You can pick up seismic signals which are basically like very low frequency sound signals over a long distance as well. We have not been doing it. We are not experts in seismics yet, but we have been pairing up with a couple of scientists who are doing seismic monitoring, and apparently they've found a lot of success in that. So they have been instrumenting, like going on top of the glacier. Well, this one is not really easy to walk on, but sometimes you can walk on the glacier, put the sensors and get back and then monitor it. So there are scientists who do that as well. As to how we are doing the monitoring, well, so there are two things. One is the question of whether it is melting more or less. And if you put a sensor at a particular glacier and you're listening to the sound, after a point I can tell you whether there is more melting or less melting simply by looking at the fact that there's more sound or less sound, right? So at least I can tell you whether the melting doubled or went half or something like that. So that is one form of monitoring we are planning to do. But the other aspect of exactly measuring how much melting is happening, there are many ways to do that. One would be, like you said, get a reference signal where you say, I melt a piece of ice maybe in the lab, or I melt a piece of ice maybe somewhere in the bay. It melts this much and I get this much sound. So if I get X amount of sound, I get this much melt. If I get 10X amount of sound, how much melt could I get? That kind of math. The other way is to go even more deeply and say, how much sound does a single bubble make? It's a bit of a tricky question, but we have colleagues who are actually working on the average sound produced by a single bubble. Now then, what you need is the average bubble density, which is how many bubbles you get per volume of ice. So if you have a sample for this glacier, that doesn't vary much over the glacier. So once you know how much sound each bubble makes, and once you know how many bubbles are there, then you have a rough idea of what sound I am hearing translates to what amount of melt. So that is the other way we are approaching it. So it's like a multi-pronged attack at the same problem, you could say.
Right, so thank you for your questions, and thank you once again, Hari, for the insightful presentation. Give him a round of applause.